Am I okay to click the button to start?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, Mike.
I think we've started. Good. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the last day of Wall Homes Week. I always find it a bit of a shame when it comes to an end. There's my colleagues across the comms team in NEA don't think it's a shame. They'll have the opportunity to breathe a collective sigh of relief and get on to other things. But it's been a fabulous week for us. I think we've had about 1,700 people online throughout the course of the conference, and we've had possibly around 2,000 people registered for it. So it's been a fantastic event. Again, it's enabled us to reach out to many more people who will not have been able to afford the time or the money to attend a physical conference. So it's been tremendous fun, actually, and thanks to all the panelists and the participants who've been there. So while there's a big sigh of relief that will probably kind of exude later on this afternoon, after we've had the exhibition of members from 12 to 1 and after we've been through the AGM from 2 to 3, but there will be a collective sigh of relief in terms of managing this conference. I hope people have enjoyed it, who've been to more than one session. We've got so much out of it. It gives us so many avenues to pursue in terms of positive working relationships with new partners. It gives us so much more insight from people at the coal front that either supports and confirms our own experiences or introduces us to new opportunities, and it enables more of us across the fuel poverty movement to get closer to being on the same page about the direction of policy. But it's not going to be a huge sigh of relief across the organisation or across participants at the conference, because we are aware that today it's a transitional moment. Furlough ends today. The universal credit uplift still due to end kind of fairly soon. We're seeing huge inflationary pressures on essential services. So the inflation that matters to low-income households is growing hugely. Erosion of income, growth in costs, not even going to go into the impact of the price rises that are going to come in. There's no question, whatever calculation or algorithm we use to understand what the impact on fuel poor households will be, and the numbers, we are talking probably close to 500,000 people extra coming into the ambit of fuel poverty or the risk of fuel poverty. So no relief from that. In fact, exactly the opposite. The end of this conference signals the start of the continuation rather of some really serious engagement over the winter, because I've said so many times, pray God it's a mild winter. The consequences of a harsh winter with all these different pressures is going to be pretty extreme, and so it's pretty sobering. It's been a great conference. I've loved every minute of it. We've learned a huge amount. We're quite proud of what we've been able to do, and I'm immensely proud of the comms team. But we go into a winter that is beset with challenge and risk. So thank you for coming along to all the sessions. That's the context. This morning's session, this again is one that I really wanted to do. When we look across and we scan the scale and the incidence and the demographics, if you want, of fuel poverty, we look at the really tough nuts to crack, and it's the private rented sector. Access to them, landlords not really interested in kind of upgrading their properties, the bad ones anyway. We look at the challenges of getting to owner occupiers, people who are on welfare benefits, so you can auto enroll or you can engage through that mechanism, people who aren't but are still seriously in fuel poverty or the risk of it. And sometimes we think that social housing, well, so much progress has been made, the incidence of fuel poverty is lower. We know there's still a big challenge, and those financial pressures will fall down on the tenants of social housing providers as much as anybody else, but there's a certain confidence that more is happening on that. And for me, that's a very good reason to focus on them. Not only because of the experience of social housing providers in trying to tackle those two twin challenges of decarbonisation towards net zero and supporting low-income, fuel-poor households, their routes to talking to tenants about their experience of route to net zero and the paths out of fuel poverty, and how the different program mechanisms. So it's great we've got a guy from Bayes to talk about the social housing decarbonisation fund. What's the experience been like of that, working with local authorities, working with housing providers, working with third parties to make life better? And in particular, for me, because so much really good innovation in terms of low carbon heating systems and energy efficiency measures in the homes of low income households have been done, how can we build on that, and how can we learn those lessons across other sectors? So that's why I was very keen that we had a session looking at it, and we're up to over 150 participants. So other people must have thought so as well. So look, delighted, we've got a fantastic panel. We've got Josh Emden from the IPPR, Guy Woodruff from Bayes, Liz Laney from Parity Projects, Liam Gregson from Northern Housing Consortium, and my colleague Michael Harmer, who's the Manager of Innovation and Technical Evaluation here at NEA. We've got a bit more time, a bit more space on the panel because we have less people than we've had on other ones. So we're going to go for presentations from everyone except Michael. Said Michael couldn't do one. Presentations from everyone up to about 10 minutes. Please use the Q&A. I've said it a couple of times. We'll try obviously to address the questions live through the panel or through the Q&A box, but it's really important for us that we take away the questions that seem really pertinent or new, or the ones that are most common, and we find ways after the conference to make sure that NEA answers the ones that we can, and we get colleagues, partners, participants to answer the ones that we can't. So we have a real good roundup of what's happened and what's been the topic of discussion so far. So that's my rambling pre-ramble. If I can go first of all to Josh, if you could uncloak in best kind of terms, and there you are, to share your screen, and we'll go to Josh Emden from IPPR first.
Great, thanks very much, Adam, and thanks very much for inviting me, and it's really good to be here. So yes, as Adam mentioned, I'm going to be going through, I suppose, an overview of the situation at the moment based on some research that we did last year, and also some upcoming research that we've got that will be published in about a month's time. Really, I think Adam kind of really kind of took my first slide, if you like, or rather summed it up much better than these charts do, which is just demonstrating that the reason why why social rented sector is so interesting is because there's a much better starting point in terms of energy efficiency, and therefore that kind of facilitates greater energy efficiency and low carbon heating as well. Dwellings in social rented sector are much more energy efficient than other tenures and have much higher EPCs of C or higher compared to other tenures. But it's also worth pointing out that there are still around 1.7 million social homes that are below an EPC of C, and may also be difficult to treat. So there's a better starting point. There's also a lot of work to go. But what I wanted to talk about today was really the opportunities, the challenges, and what we can do about that. And very much kind of in relation to how the opportunities translate to other tenures as well, and kind of, as Adam mentioned, kind of hinted at kind of learnings that can be kind of transferred to other tenure types. But the first thing to stress is, with energy efficiency and low carbon heating combined, if it's installed in the right way, and obviously that's a rather big caveat, but if it's installed in the right way, there is an opportunity for substantial bill savings for tenants. The second thing is that because the social housing sector is more developed in terms of the energy efficiency of their tenure, of those tenures, there's an opportunity for really developing the retrofitting supply chain for some of the other tenures for owner occupiers and for private rented sector, and that can really help to drive down costs for those households, and it can alleviate some of the the burden on policymakers potentially. It's also a really, in social housing sector, it's also a really good model for positive engagement with tenants, insofar as there's a social obligation to be speaking to tenants. And again, that sort of method of communication is something that we can look at, potentially improve, but also be translating into other tenures. And then finally, there's a really good opportunity to demonstrate whole house heating approaches, which is to say multiple retrofit measures being installed in houses, We talked about this briefly just before the session went live, but I couldn't agree more with what Adam was saying about the idea that some sort of social housing projects can be kind of laboratories for expanding other kinds of models of retrofitting. But there are obviously substantial challenges as well, and the cost is just one of them. So on average, just under £10,000 per home, but that's going to be higher for harder to treat homes. Now, of course, when it comes to social housing, there's a question of who is paying as well. So how are costs being transferred on to tenants, and indeed should they be at all? There's also a major challenge about the quality of insulation, and that should say installation, but it's both really. By which I mean that we need to have skills in place in the industry to make sure that these technologies, when I say technologies, I mean insulation and probably mostly heat pumps, should be installed in a high quality way. We've been doing lots of research about this, which demonstrates that the biggest problem is not actually the technology itself, but the quality of the installation. So that's going to be really critical to both maximising the bill saving potential, but also the trust in these kinds of new technologies themselves. Disruption and awareness are obviously also crucial barriers. Going into someone's house, particularly if they're in a kind of flat and and doing a deep retrofit, is going to be really disruptive. So making people aware of what's going to happen, communicating that well in advance, and also giving people time to make preparations, and indeed helping people make preparations if it's the case that they need to be temporarily moved out of the accommodation, making sure that there's available alternative accommodation to do that, depending on, of course, the level of retrofit. So things are going to be disruptive. You need to minimize the number of instances of disruption and communicate early and often with people about it. And give them, I suppose, that's crucially, make sure that they are engaged in the process in the first place, making sure that they are, they're part of the decision-making process rather than just having things done to them. And then the final thing, which kind of underpins really the success of, or the potential of the success of any of this, is capacity of local authorities and housing providers to actually enact any of these retrofits and any programs in the first place. So that's obviously a massive challenge at the moment, but it's going to be really crucial to make sure that any kind of scheme delivery is actually successful. Just going a little bit more into kind of the challenges around costs. There's obviously the upfront cost and the fact that the funding programs for local authorities can take a long time to be approved and don't tend to fit in with the more short-termist national government approach of throwing grants at things. Housing associations may face higher borrowing costs than local authorities, so there needs to be a disparity that's addressed there. It's really important to ensure that costs aren't passed on to tenants unless bill savings are guaranteed, and arguably costs shouldn't be passed on to tenants at all. Ideally, it should be policy to provide help with upfront costs. And then this is really crucial. It's particularly in light of today's news that energy efficiency and policy reform of electric bills is essential to lowering running costs. And what I mean by that is that we really need to be incentivizing people to be moving to energy efficiency by taking away some of the policy costs from bills, and as many people have said, including us, moving them over to general taxation. Moving them onto gas bills, as is today's proposal, is in principle not a bad idea, but an absolutely terrible time to be doing it, given the increases in gas prices. The theory is that it motivates people to move to electric heating, but when heat pumps are still expensive and there's no sufficient grant to incentivize people to take them up sufficiently, and then you're just penalizing people more when they have no opportunity to move on to a substitute. So moving policy costs on bills into general taxation is going to be absolutely crucial. I know it's something that Treasury is resistant to, but there's lots of people that are saying it, and it would be much, much fairer. And if we want to go into the discussion of how it'd be fairer, I'm more than happy to do that. But I don't want to hold up my slides or anyone else. And then the final thing is that there's an opportunity for private financial solutions to be introduced into this. We don't want to overstate them too much, but there are some sort of nascent ways of financing things that could be used, but they're still at an early stage. In terms of the quality of installation itself, as I said, there's a need for long-term policy to give industry confidence. There's a need to enforce high-quality installation, so to make sure that the people are actually, that the installers are actually coming in and doing a good job. At the moment, the enforcement mechanisms aren't great. There's a need to ramp up scale of training to provide high-quality installing. That's both the kind of the knowledge of what the actual skills will be, and then a greater funding for them. And then there's a need to bring together energy efficiency and low carbon heating together. That's a really crucial finding that we've kind of looked at, that is essential to minimize instances of disruption, and also to minimize the risk of kind of incompatible installations if you install energy efficiency and low carbon heating together. As I've already mentioned, disruption to households is going to be significant. There's also a massive variation in housing stock. And obviously that's going to be a real challenge to address. Not every single house is going to be the same. So it's not an obvious way to do all these things, although I'd be really interested in the examples from kind of social housing providers that have specific blocks of housing. And then clear communication, as I said, to raise awareness and provide information is going to be absolutely essential. Finally, as I say, local authority capacity. What I mean by that is looking at kind of as I say, increasing capacity to deliver schemes, but also recognizing that street-by-street approaches, that kind of area-based scheme, may well include different tenure types, and it's going to require capacity to engage and create opt-in programs for those homes beyond just kind of the social homes that the councils might normally deal with. And then finally, there's a real need to kind of move towards performance-based measurement, which is to say, moving beyond EPCs to be measuring the actual performance of technologies, which is, again, something I can get into a little bit more in the discussion if it's of interest. Currently, policy environment in the UK is mixed, shall we say. There's a big gap of funding for kind of the sector at large. The Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, it has kind of done some promising early demonstration, but it really needs to be ramped up, and currently it's sort of being underfunded. There are some good examples of policy. So the local local authority delivery scheme, the home upgrades grant. We were an acronym city here with these programs, but there are some good examples of kind of local delivery. There's limited support for scaling up skills. There's no serious advice service in England, and that's really, really crucial because there sort of is in Scotland and Wales, and they've proven to be really good examples of how to engage with people. Admittedly, that's more for other tenures than for social homes, but I think it's still crucial to have advice services in general. And there's also potentially problems with targeting and prioritising homes, and that really speaks to kind of data problems, which is going to be really crucial for local authorities in general. And again, it's where a social housing could really lead the way. So in terms of what we're proposing, we kind of try to, I'll kind of rattle through this quite quickly, and it might be the case that we can discuss some of this afterwards, because I don't want to take up too much of anyone else's time. But I suppose the four things we're looking at are, if you like, we're trying to take a catchy approach to this, which is standards, skills, cash, comms, and capacity. I hate it, but I think it's we're trying to be flashy about it. But in terms of looking at the standards, I suppose some of these are quite familiar in terms of things like recommendations from the CCC about banning the sale of oil boilers and gas boilers. We're also proposing to introduce a whole house heat standard. What this really does is making sure that energy efficiency and low carbon heating is brought together and installed at the same time, again, to minimize instances of disruption and minimize the instances of incompatible installations. And then having all social homes to meet an EPC of B by 2030. Obviously, that already exists in Scotland for 2032, and for Wales, we know that there's going to be kind of an increase to EPC of, or likely an increase to EPC of A. So this is almost like a de minimis, a baseline for the rest of the UK. In terms of skills, we're talking about expanding the training standards to encourage that installation of energy efficiency and low carbon heating together. Having a training fund that will pay for training costs to incentivize installers to take it up more, increasing capacity to verify and accredit bodies, and ban this idea of pay to pass training where someone just turns up for a day and then gets qualified. There needs to be a greater professionalization of the industry there. We're proposing, in terms of the cash side of it, we're proposing increasing funding for the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, a substantial increase to £3.6 billion per year, at least half of which would come from public funding, and then fuel grants for fuel poor homes across the board. It's important to say that this £3.6 billion per year is a maximum ambition scenario. So it is much higher than, if you like, is needed for net zero. It would take retrofits to be well above EPC and likely above EPC of B as well. This is kind of at the cost of ultra high energy efficiency retrofits. But because we're in the social housing sector, there's already kind of good progress made. So we thought, why not be as ambitious as we possibly can? And then there's also some private financing options as well that we kind of mentioned before. So green mortgages. And again, I won't go into all of them, but we can discuss that perhaps in a bit more detail in the discussion. Then final thing is looking at comms and capacity, and that's what's really crucial here is it's important for the social housing sector, but it's also across every sector more generally, which is rolling out a national information campaign with a national energy advice service. That, a lot of our research has shown people just aren't familiar enough with these technologies, but they are generally supportive of policies to incentivize them. So that's there's a huge amount of informing that the government can do. There's also the need to introduce sort of building renovation passports at household level to provide clear information. That's something that can be done with social housing tenures, with social housing as well, between social landlords and tenants. Again, so kind of really important to kind of to model that communication. Again, increasing local authority capacity, but also sharing data to deliver area-based approaches to improve that kind of targeting and prioritization, as alluded to earlier. And then again, once again, kind of integrating real use performance measurement into building retrofits to both build confidence in the insulation and low carbon heating technologies themselves, and also kind of demonstrate that people are getting what they paid for in terms of performance and improvements to heating. Apologies for going slightly over. That's a bit of a whistle stop tour, but I will stop there.
Unmute. It was a fantastic whistle stop tour. Lots of issues in that. A couple of things that kind of resonated, particularly huge amount in there. A lot of it resonates. The advice thing I absolutely agree with the particular opportunities in the social housing sector with asset life and engagement in these things over a period of time. Not just to install well and cost efficiently and tell householders what you're doing and why you're doing it and how they may benefit, but then just understand what the actual benefits are and how people adapt to them over the lifetime of the new technology being in there, which is a kind of insight return loop which we might not have as well in different tenures. But Guy, that was a suggestion there that it should be 3.6 billion for the fund, and that you deliver things much faster than you. So perfect cue for you. So over to you.
Okay, thanks very much, and let me just move to share my screen. So hopefully that's visible to everybody. Good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for having me with you today, and the opportunity to engage with you around the journey to net zero 2050 for social housing. I'm Guy Woodruff. I'm the policy lead for the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund within BEIS. I've been in BEIS for just over 12 months now, and I joined just as we were standing up the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund demonstrator project, which we launched around a year ago, and which is currently live with spades going into the ground across the country. Just to say, I mean, in that 12-month and the engagements that I've had with the sector, I've been hugely impressed by the passion, the enthusiasm, and the commitment from right across the sector and from everybody engaged in the sector. What I wanted to run through this morning was just to give a bit of the context to the Decarbonisation Fund, take a look at kind of where we are now, a little bit about where we want to go, and a look to the future. Thanks to Josh for setting the scene really well. I won't spend too much time on that context, because I think Josh did a really good job of kind of really sort of setting it out. But what I would say is that I think the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund is part of the solution. It's not the whole solution by any means, and I think what Josh was highlighting about both, you know, the sums of money needed for this, but also the challenges that you set out in terms of the cost, the quality, the disruption, and the capacity. These are all things where we need to work together to address them. So it is very much a collaboration. So to say the fund itself is not the silver bullet. It is one part of the solution, and some other parts are being delivered by colleagues across Bays and in other government departments, and of course working closely with the sector. So as Josh was saying, we know that social housing remains one of the more efficient tenure types, but we've still got kind of around 40% of the social rented homes, around 1.7 million that are below EPC-C, although the majority of these, I think so, around 1.4 million are at EPC-D. So there remains a smaller but still significant part of the stock, which is that kind of harder to treat, harder to reach homes for people. But what we also know that as you kind of move down those energy performance certificate ratings, then the average cost that people are paying increases. So it's really important that we do address those harder to treat homes, and you'll see later on, I mean, that is part of our approach and part of our strategy for the decarbonisation fund. But I'd say we're one part of a broader kind of government and collective response to the challenges of improving the energy performance of homes, and importantly reducing the demand for energy. So I think that is a critical part of that kind of long-term solution for how we address fuel poverty and how we support tenants on low incomes, by working with social housing landlords, working with tenants, working together to improve the energy performance of homes and really to reduce that demand. And I think that's really a critical point. So you know, we're really committed to ensuring that, you know, those who find themselves in fuel poverty aren't left behind in that transition to net zero, and in fact that we can deliver benefits to them earlier in that transition, and in particular in social housing. I mean, I like to think that we will work with the sector, and we've talked about kind of how forward leaning the social housing sector is, and I've really kind of found that to be true and kind of justified. So let's take advantage of that and really deliver those benefits as early as we can. But we're doing a number of things to address kind of fuel poverty and support low income families. And so we launched the Sustainable Warmth competition in June, which is coming together of the local authority delivery scheme and the home upgrade grant, as Josh said earlier, a few acronyms there, but we launched the latest competition in June with funding going to local authorities, and the focus there is very much on that upgrading of the worst insulated homes in the owner occupier and in the private rented sector. and these are very much about supporting retrofit measures in those lowest ratings, sort of D, E, Fs and Gs. We've also got the energy company obligation. We recently consulted on the next phase of that, Eco 4, and increased the value of Eco. So we're currently looking through those consultation responses and reviewing those to see how we might adjust that particular scheme going forward. But of course, what we have for social housing is the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund. England only, I would also stress. There are other grants and funding mechanisms within Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So a bit more about the Decarbonisation Fund. So I think probably the majority of people will be kind of aware of its origins, but it stemmed from the National Infrastructure Commission recommendation back in 2018 about there being a major government spend programme to decarbonise social housing, and that translated into the Conservative manifesto commitment to a £3.8 billion social housing decarbonisation fund over 10 years to improve the energy performance of homes. It may well not be enough, but I think this is again where we'll be looking to kind of combine what we have in Bays with what others can bring to the table, whether it's social housing landlords themselves and how we can align funding with the long-term asset management strategies and their own plans for delivering net zero. But that 3.8 billion was part of a broader 9.2 billion investment into the energy efficiency of not just homes but public buildings as well, including schools and hospitals. So we also benefited from £50 million in as part of the 2020 economic update, and that resulted in the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund demonstrator, which, as I say, is currently running, and actually because of the success of that demonstrator programme, the funding was increased. So it's now of the order of 60 million of Bays funding, which is more than matched by social housing landlords. So a significant programme of work, and that is very much looking at kind of innovation in the sort of deep whole house retrofit space. So what can we do to address some of those worst performing homes, and how can we do it in kind of one intervention? So we are learning a lot from that, but as we move forward into the main fund, then I think we'll need to kind of look at how we focus those funds to deliver maximum value for money. So as part of that kind of longer term funding commitment, and what we expect to be doing in the future, we have 160 million committed for the coming in this financial year, and that's the first wave of the sort of main programme of works. So those are some of the numbers, but turning now to kind of what we're actually aiming to do through the fund. So of course it's about upgrading as many of those 1.6 million kind of homes as we possibly can through the deployment of the decarbonisation fund, and really helping to address the fuel poverty targets, and the clean growth strategy ambition in particular. So we've got kind of four main aims there, and what I highlighted, sorry, that shouldn't have flicked forward. are a couple of really relevant targets there, where we are supporting the delivery of fuel poverty targets, and in particular, and including the interim target around getting as many homes to band C by 2030, but the interim target of band D by 2025. And again, very much focused on improving the energy performance of homes to address those fuel poverty challenges. So a bit of a look at what we're doing with the current competition. We've called this wave one of the social housing decarbonisation fund. As I say, it's a £160 million competition. It opened in August this year, closes in a couple of weeks' time. Hopefully there'll be people who are dialed into this, who are putting forward applications into that competition. It's open to all registered providers of social housing, albeit it needs to be led by a local authority, although we're looking to change that for future waves. But just to kind of stress the approach, and this is what I was talking about earlier, we're taking a kind of fabric first approach, so really focused on driving down that demand for energy in the first place, and tackling bills. We kind of estimate that on average people would see a reduction of somewhere around £170 a year. That's an average, and it's modelled, so we'll need to see what happens in reality, but certainly it will support driving down bills. We are incentivising a worse first approach, so we will look to really kind of get into those homes below D, because those are some of the most challenging, and as I said earlier, that's where you see people paying more for their energy bills. So we really want to get into those, and we also want to take that kind of lowest regrets approach to the future, which means what we do now is part and parcel of what we need to do tomorrow as well. So we're not having to go back and revisit properties and homes in the future. So that's what we're doing now. A bit of a kind of forward look. So yeah, looking a bit further ahead, and noting, of course, this comes with the caveat that all kind of future funds and delivery of further waves is subject to and dependent on fiscal events. This is, of course, not yet confirmed funding, but this is the plan for the future. Wave two of the decarbonisation fund will sort of continue the journey that we're starting with wave one, and we'll want to really start to kind of motor on addressing those 1.6 million homes, and we'll continue to take that fabric first approach. We'll continue to want to get into the worst first, but also recognizing, as I said, we've got that kind of 1.4 million approximately of homes that are at the EPC D level that we also need to be addressing. And the fund will be available across England. And what we'll want to make sure is that it's accessible and accessed and is delivering to all regions and all parts of the country, so kind of everybody can benefit from this. And so in support of that, and in support of making sure that we can bring everybody on this journey together, and it responds to kind of one of Josh's points about information and support. What we've also put in place as a bit of a kind of test case is this social housing retrofit accelerator. So this is there, and it's supporting the social housing landlords, and at the moment it's very much kind of focused on supporting applications into the Wave 1 competition, and that's there to take the learning, take the understanding that we've kind of got collectively, and provide that in support of social housing landlords, so registered providers of social housing, and the key part of that is about tenant engagement, how we support the tenant as part of this journey, how we can increase the communication engagement with tenants as part of the retrofitting kind of process, how we can help them make the most of the interventions that we're making. So that is being kind of tested and piloted at the moment. We expect to continue that and build on that, and bring together that kind of knowledge base and that learning and really share that. So yeah, as I said up front, kind of fully recognize that the fund by itself is not the whole solution. It can't fully decarbonize social housing stock by itself. So it is something that we need to work together at, that kind of we bring our collective kind of ambition and drive and commitment and passion together, and that we really can put tenants as well at the heart of what we're all seeking to do. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Guy. There was a huge amount in there, and I think there's very valuable.
Yeah, apologies.
No. I'm just saying it's an absolute virtue, and for Liz and Liam as well. That just take the time you need, because I think there's a tremendous amount there. Always so much in there. I won't ask you about this coming fiscal events, because I appreciate the basement can't do that. For future fiscal events though, because that's it. So it's good we've got a 3-year spending review. Thank goodness for that. But that just takes us 3 years. The challenge is how we kind of make sure that the positive lessons from the fund and from other activity, not just in terms of asset optimization improvement for housing associations, but for people in fuel poverty, and for the drive towards net zero, and the efficient way of making past 2035 work, and all those sorts of things feed into the advocacy, which has to start now, for future fiscal events. The other thing, I think the one area of concern I think that we do have, but a number of programs is, I think it's brilliant to focus on local authorities. Get worried about where you have the intersection of high levels of fuel poverty, properties which clearly need delivering, but you don't have the local authority for whatever reason that hasn't got the capability or the capacity or the folk memory or the risk appetite to put itself forward for these schemes. I think there's something there that we need to work on. Anyway, without further ado, thank you very much, Guy. Moving to Liz Laney from Parity Projects, who do a huge amount of great work with local authorities and social housing providers. So a bit about your experience and how it kind of fits into the general drive towards doing this stuff in the homes of the low-income households.
Yeah, great. I'm just showing my screen. Should be able to see that now. So yeah, Parity Projects was set up about 15 years ago, and our mission is to provide independent advice, just learning from our MD's initial experience of retrofitting his own home, and finding all advice on products was related to manufacturers and installers, and no one could provide an independent or a whole house picture. So our mission now is to provide a whole house plan for every house in the country across tenure through various channels, and there's some of our current clients on the left-hand side there. So I'm going to speak to 4 particular challenges we've come across and how we think data can help address those challenges. I'm not saying it's a whole solution, and I'd like to thank some of the previous panelists for covering some of this ground. But the first off is data. And do landlords and local authorities know enough about their data? So my background's in consumer advocacy and working at Citizens Advice. A lot of our work was around ensuring consumer data was protected across a number of sectors, but that just wasn't the issue with data in the housing sector. It exists, but it's not being used, and the quality is really variable. And sometimes that quality is putting people off, even if the data is available. So that's what we're helping our clients address, because if you don't have your data ready and those plans, those whole house plans ready, then opportunities are being missed. So we help our social landlord clients align retrofit works with their other planned works. So you get efficiencies there. So you can turn voids into an opportunity rather than a challenge, because one of the issues with some measures is the disruption it will cause for tenants. So why aren't we making more use of properties when they're empty? And then thirdly, being able to respond quickly to grants and subsidies. So the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, I know that the team did get a bit of an extension to the window for applications, but still the applicants will have had to have their data ready at the opening of that application window. And the problem across landlords is how data is held in multiple systems, in multiple formats, and also EPC data, if they are able to get it. And it's an ongoing issue for me that I've been raising with CLG, MHCLG, and now LUHC, is that landlords and homeowners don't have a right to the survey data that sits behind their EPCs. So no one is working with the full picture of their properties, even though that survey has been paid for. But so you don't necessarily have the full data. And if EPCs are older, then it can be out of date. So that's what we're working with as an entry point for data analysis. I don't want to do too much of a pitch for our product. So briefly, Portfolio helps landlords with all their rich data. We have a service for local authorities that helps local authorities analyse EPC level data across their area, and we have ways of improving the quality of that. And then we can link that through to an online service that helps owner occupiers develop whole house plans for their properties. But back to the challenge of data and making use of it. It can be held in many different systems, in many different formats. And what we do is help landlords make sense of that and pull it together with the cost of work, what we know about both the stock, the property types, and about measures on the market. So we work with around 3,000 variations on measures. And once we have your stock data or landlord stock data on our platform, we're then able to test those 3,000 variations and come up with the most suitable package for every home. But before that, we can do baseline reporting. So just being able to report on property types, what's driving poor energy performance in terms of the SAP ratings. We can identify where there are particular pockets of likely fuel poverty. We can inform decisions on stock condition surveys to improve the quality of your data. When you get into net zero reporting, you need that baseline so you can measure improvement against it. But probably the most practical use of it, the baseline reporting at the moment, is for tailoring engagement of schemes. There are restrictions on use of EPC data for direct marketing, but it can be used to tailor engagement. So we can layer what we know about properties over other socioeconomic data to make sure help is going to the right places. And then I mentioned the investment scenarios where we test options. So we, against every home, we test the relevant measures for every home to come up with the most cost-effective route to the target specified. So I'd say the first challenge, data, it's a matter of investing, and don't be held back by concerns about the quality of your data, because actually that can be resolved by analysing what data you already have. So on to the second challenge of finance. I think the two previous panelists have well, will know more about this than me and have covered it to a certain extent anyway. I think for us, it's clear the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund won't fund all the works that are needed, but it's very important to get the scale going. We like the focus on the worst first, and sort of the intention to get a good coverage of different types of landlords and across the country to start building some of that scale and building understanding of what's required and what's possible amongst the supply chain and amongst tenants. And in terms of the return on investment for government, there is that scale, and there's the socioeconomic benefit, which obviously they value, but also is valued by the finance sector. So where data comes into this is data that the reports we can run can support ESG reporting, so looking at the sustainability reporting standard that some of our clients are signed up for. These are pretty standard reports for us, but I would say both to landlords and finance providers is to ask more of the data. We can provide figures on the total cost of work, the cost at address line for properties, and the impact on heating and fuel bills, and the impact on SAP performance. So I think we'd like to see people go a bit further really in what they're asking of the data. Then the third challenge is the supply chain and its preparedness. We've done quite a lot of modelling on this. It's evident in some work by New Economic Foundation that was published last year, and the proposed strategies from the Construction Leadership Council that will show net zero offers around 500,000 jobs by 2030 just in housing retrofit. But there's this vicious circle that because there's low demand, finance providers don't have the scale to make the business case for lending, and installers aren't investing in the skills or in selling it to customers. So customers lack knowledge and confidence in the supply chain, and therefore there's low demand. And that doesn't seem like it's going to be broken anytime soon. But what we are starting to do for various local authorities, and through this modelling we've done for those higher level policy and strategy asks, is analysing what jobs are needed and where and over what time. So for all the recommendations we make to clients for work, against every single measure, we know what skills are required and how much time is required of that tradesperson. And so we can report on what jobs and what skills are required for delivery of the subsequent plan, so as shown here. So, and we can do that against different, as standard, we can do it against different delivery trajectories. Okay, and then fourthly, tenant engagement. So it's something we're just coming to really, and I could, partly because I could see it was an important part of Bays's thinking in the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund development. So found this report particularly helpful. So three areas that we should be looking at for tenant engagement. So how we motivate and engage tenants. The idea, as many of you will know, fuel poverty is a turn-off, but can we talk more about healthy homes? People have a better understanding of the importance of air quality, for example, how much bill savings resonate, but also that place-based approach. I think this is where the fund and its spread across the country and different landlords is needed, is that people need to see these measures going in, but they also need to see carbon reductions made across a landlord's activities or across a local authority's activities for it to make sense that they should be taking action in their own home. Then on communication, this need to cut jargon and train staff and learn from case studies. And in our user group recently, and I think some of you might be on this call, I was asking our users about vulnerability and how we should how we can identify in the data that we might hold. We don't hold any personal data on residents, but what we might be able to pick up from more general demographic data. And it was really felt you don't know what the vulnerabilities are before you start the rollout, and maybe those traditional vulnerabilities, which are still relevant in terms of age and physical health, and maybe children with young families, those might be evident. But the one that came up was the idea of hoarding, and that a gentleman who was hoarding possessions, it took a number of months to clear the space to install the pipework for heat pumps. And that's not something we can pick up from data. So we need to allow for those additional vulnerabilities in our planning as customer liaison. And then thirdly, trust, which probably is an element that Parity can help more with. So it's about the quality of service. You know, we work closely with retrofit coordinators and have a good understanding of the PAS 2035 regime. They don't ask me personally questions about that. And also this whole house approach, the importance of only going in once into every home. And that's exactly what we do. So on the left-hand side is a whole house plan. So when we test all the measures for every home and come up with a plan, that is then listed for the user. So they can see all the measures listed in cost-effective order and the impact on key metrics. And then that can be divided into phases for delivery. And if you change the order of work, then that means that there's a better, more efficient solution should go in the second phase, and the software will adapt that automatically for you. And then in our reporting on the right hand side, that's just to show that we can then report that across the whole stock or a group of properties, you know, what measures are required and what costs that comes in at. I think I've talked about those a couple of times. So social value of retrofit, I think Josh has talked about those quite enough. Maybe the business benefits for a housing association, and that it reduces voids and improves the length of tenure, and also can reduce some maintenance costs, probably another benefit. So recommendations. So Guy mentioned the number of schemes that are around and the metrics that you're working to for net zero and for fuel poverty. I think we need some more certainty now on what is the target for net zero then. And we've been on our own journey through this. So we started out modelling decarbonisation, so carbon emissions of homes against the decarbonisation of the grid, and have taken the decision in the last 12 months that actually we need to let the grid do its work, and we have to assume it will do its work and deliver net zero. And so therefore we would be, well, the targets that we work with clients on are how do you decarbonise heat? So, and it's only through electrification of heat, and what does it mean on top of that for a property to be affordable to run? And we tend to measure that in terms of heating demand and SAP. So SAP doesn't necessarily relate directly to heating demand. And then we want clarity and simplicity on funding. So there are all these different funding streams. It's difficult enough for us to understand them, let alone an owner-occupier, but we'd rather that the government came forward with the simple funding, the single funding stream, or whether there's an advice layer that funnels those into property owners. That'd be great. Increased data reporting requirements. So we think a lot more can be done with data to understand how to address some of the issues that others have raised, whether that's finance or understanding supply chain needs. The data is around, it can be reported, but someone needs to ask for it and get those plans together for SAPC and net zero. And finally, my decade-long ask of please can homeowners and all property owners have a right to survey data behind EPC. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Liz. The thing that always, so in the work that we do sometimes with housing associations or local authorities, especially when we're not, when they're not active partners and they're looking for people to work with them, but when we try to persuade people to do it, the data and the internal ability to understand what data will determine what actions and investments they might want to make and what the returns will be for their business and for their tenants, and therefore just the whole rationale for doing it is, I think, is really challenging for lots of the local authorities and social housing providers. So it's really great to understand, what might be available to add to those capabilities and capacities from third parties. That's brilliant. So I quickly turn to Liam Grigson from Northern Housing Consortium. We've stolen Liam away from another conference on NECO in the Northeast about retrofit. So we're absolutely delighted that you joined us rather than stuck with them. Liam, over to you.
Oh no, that's great. Cheers, Adam, and thanks to NEA for allowing me to be part of today. I'm not too sure how I managed to find myself on such a high caliber agenda, but it's been a great discussion, and I'd like to think I'll be able to contribute to the discussion and talk about a project the Northern Housing Consortium has been involved with 5 of our members on the social housing tenants climate jury. A lot of the themes that have been discussed by other speakers today: cost, disruption, quality, and trust. Liz just mentioned in the importance of tenant engagement and highlighting that place shapers and TPAS work, and we've been grateful to have the involvement of TPAS in this work that we've been doing on the tenant jury. And it's all about bringing together social housing tenants into the heart of the discussion on retrofit, and what are their main issues and what are their priorities and how they see these programs being delivered. So very quickly on the Northern Housing Consortium, we're a membership organisation based in the north of England. We'd like to consider ourselves the voice of housing in the north. We work with local authorities, both stock holding and non-stock holding, housing associations and ALMOs. And overall, our members own or manage 9 out of 10 socially rented homes in the north. And since early 2020, our work on net zero, addressing climate change, building on the need for retrofit, has fallen under the banner of Our North Net Zero. This is kind of inspired by the NHC's long-standing interest in the regeneration of our existing homes and neighbourhoods, and we've taken this renewal through decarbonisation angle. We've commissioned research with IPPR North, identifying the job creation potential of retrofit. We've recently launched our Northern Housing Monitor, which identifies that around 4 million homes in the north need green home upgrades if by 2035, if the government are going to achieve their net zero targets. And we've also events and roundtables, bringing our members together from across the north, learning from regional and national good practice. And of course, a big part of that is tenant engagement, and this initial work that we've done highlighted both the scale of the challenge, but the need and the consensus that where our members have been a little bit ahead of the curve on retrofit, the understanding is there that positive customer experience is essential to the long-term success of any program. There was a need to think innovatively about how tenants can be brought into the heart of the discussion, as I say. And that's where we fell on the idea of a tenants climate jury. We need to start from the point that these are people's homes, and the work is invasive potentially, and that needs cooperation and buy-in. With the jury, we feel that this is the correct way to go. Climate juries are part of the zeitgeist. We've had the National UK Climate Assembly. We've had IPPR have done important work in the Tees Valley. NHC members want to understand the views of their tenants, much like the population at large. So there's that transferable idea of the tenant base as a population. And the jury itself allows for in-depth conversation, exploration of support for retrofit interventions, 30 hours of deliberation spread over 10 weeks. We invite experts and guests in to give talks. They take questions. There's a very important priority of being representative and inclusive. Invitees and applicants taken from our partners, although taken from the partners are randomly selected. There is incentives offered and expenses. We offer IT support and resources, and applicants are sampled to try and reflect demographic makeup. And overall, that builds a legitimacy. Whereas obviously, if we're dealing with something in depth, everyone can see someone that they can relate to within the jury makeup, and that's central to sharing learning. And just overall, so we ended up with the jury 30 social housing residents in the north of England brought in to answer the question, how can we all work together to tackle climate change at the most local level in our homes and in our neighbourhoods? And in answering that question, also provide their thoughts on energy efficiency measures, renewable heating technology, and how this work can be done in a way that acknowledges needs and aspirations, minimises or mitigates disruption, and makes sure that energy uses in the home is sustainable over the long term. And so the jury finished this week, and we await their recommendations. They'll be launched at the start of November. But what I was really hoping to do today was really trail some findings and maybe talk about the themes that underpinned the recommendations as they'll come. And as I say, long-standing issues that many of our speakers today have talked about, but hopefully I can add a flavour from the tenants' perspective themselves. The first one on retrofit and renewable heating technology, and it's been quite interesting today to hear the whole house versus fabric first debate play out, and there very much was a debate amongst the tenants that made up the jury. There were those that favoured the all-in-one go approach. Speakers today have explained the benefits of that quite well, but there was others who were maybe more cautious, certainly on renewable heating and a technology pathway, and a desire to buy time and see how things develop. Even in disagreement, there was common ground, though, perceived urgency of the issue, and a feeling that regardless of what technology pathway we ultimately take, sorting out that insulation, making homes more energy efficient, is work that can be very much done now and should be done as soon as possible. On renewables, this was really a case of choice and communication, really. If there is a favoured pathway, heat pumps, for example, then it's about explaining why and offering an understanding as to why the alternatives weren't suitable. Really a case of there not necessarily being a right or wrong answer in our group's eyes, but a desire to understand and be part of the process, and very much ensure everything is done to a high standard, and the solution is the correct one, as I say, for the long term. I think those clear fears and feelings that decisions made now could come back to haunt us 5-10 years down the line. And that inspired this priority of collaboration, standards, and accreditation, also very important. And this idea, if it's going to be done, then let's do it correctly and to a high standard, and work collaboratively to pool risk and reward. In terms of costs and managing disruption, again, a clear theme all the way throughout on communicating early and clearly. People understood the discrepancy between government funding and the scale of the challenge, and wanted to understand how that gap was being met. Guy talked about this earlier, and if government funding is obviously one part of this, then we all need to work together to create this greater understanding of what that bigger picture is on funding, and importantly, at what point, if there will be any point, hopefully not, that tenants themselves would be called upon to contribute through their rent. Maintenance was also brought up here as well. The understanding about government grants and funding programs for installation, but this creates a new maintenance issue further down the line, and people wanted to know about what this meant for their landlords' traditional repairs and maintenance services, and of course that potential disruption and how it would be mitigated against. Timely information was called upon for timescales and duration of work. What exactly will happen? There was talk of floorboards coming up, radiators need to be replaced, having specific radiators for heat pumps, for example. What exactly will happen and when? And what is the expectation that is being placed on the tenant? Will they need to temporarily move out, take time off work, for example? There was concern over socially isolated or vulnerable tenants, or those with children and large families, and how these extra pressures can be alleviated to some extent. On education and communication, given the scale of change, the jury felt that every effort should be taken to educate and upskill tenants. This is on the type of interventions that make up retrofits, so understanding more about insulation and understanding more about renewable heating technology, what they look like and how they work and how the tenant would have to work them, but also on the sort of this big picture reason as to why we're doing this, tackling climate change, making homes healthier and more green. There was a few instances of the jury citing the knowledge on climate change that they gained in earlier sessions as to sort of acknowledging, or well, increasing their support, or at least acknowledging the need for retrofit measures. So it might not necessarily for some people be about co-benefits, although co-benefits should be built into the retrofit process. It's about just understanding why that's happening, and then the job becomes making sure it's done properly. That relates obviously to standards and gaining approval for solutions and making sure that it's achieved. There's talk of bringing independent bodies in, accreditors, how that fits in with past 2035 and what a landlord can do on that point. And this all points to new skills and new approaches from a landlord perspective. That ties into communication and this need for a new holistic communication strategy. And with landlords working across departments to ensure that understanding is and consistency is there from a staff perspective as well, and the information that is given is clear across a range of mediums to suit all tenants' needs. And then finally, in terms of tackling climate change at a neighbourhood level, the jury kind of discussed a lot about utilising green space in community areas, and that's so it's bringing about both social and environmental benefits. Community gardens and food plots are obviously ways you can increase interaction, and but it's also opportunity to build in resilience. So tree planting for cooling, sustainable drainage, wider flood prevention work was all discussed. Collaboration with local government and others across a range of schemes, so recycling initiatives, active travel and public transport, working with community groups on their priorities. Overall, just understanding that there were dots to be joined up on making neighbourhoods environmentally sustainable, nicer to look at, happier, healthier places more in general. And next, in terms of next steps, the final report and recommendations are launched at the 2nd November at our Northern Housing Summit. We're presenting tomorrow as part of a pre-COP26 showcase at All for Climate Italy online. Unfortunately, I don't have my plane tickets unbooked. And beyond that, there'll be a comprehensive program of dissemination plan where we'll be looking to work with all those interested in bringing that climate change, tenant involvement agendas together to make homes healthier and more energy efficient. Thank you.
Thanks, Liam.
And I'll stop there. Very quick whistle stop there, but I was keen to allow some time for discussion.
I think the jury is a really interesting kind of way of going about it. So I'm going to bring Michael in next, but I'm going to bring him in response to one of the questions. I've got 3 general questions. We've got about it's about over 15 minutes. I've got 3 general questions, and the panel can pick up whichever one they feel is most kind of relevant to you. The first one actually is just picking up on Liam's point, because it was in Josh's as well. This kind of deliberative democracy approach. This is sort of understanding the views of tenants or of householders, and how we can use those more effectively into the next iteration of government programs or government kind of policy making, because it does feel hugely, and I understand why, that we've got a number of physical properties that we need to address. What's the best way of doing those? Or we've got a number of assets that we might need to persuade people to make more lower carbon, rather than the soft, fleshy, awkward human beings that inhabit these properties. So I'd be really interested in that, how we can use deliberative democracy to inform the next iteration of policy. There was a really good question in the Q&A, how we upgrade the least efficient homes when they aren't value for money, either in the eyes of government or in the eyes of a social housing provider. So I think people might want to pick that up. And the last one, and the one I want Michael to come in on initially, is to answer the question I can maybe pose at the first stage. What is happening, or what has been happening in social housing properties around trying to understand low carbon tech in the homes of low income households, and what pointers does it give us for how we might be able to translate some of this into other homes? So Michael, I'm going to put you on the spot there, but if you could just kind of a few minutes on that, and then the rest of the panel pick up whichever one of those 3 issues you feel is most germane to you. Michael, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Adam. That's great. Yeah, so I've got a few thoughts on that, and those thoughts I think are echoed by some of the panelists today that I heard. So I think there's a huge amount of learning. I mean, Josh mentioned about laboratories, these funding streams being sort of opportunities for laboratories, and that's very, very true. I think that's stifled by the funding guidelines. I think the decarbonisation fund demonstrator that Guy mentioned that's currently live was a good example of that, because within the funding stream, as well as providing the measures that were carefully considered and chosen and evaluated by BEIS, there was an opportunity in there for the partners to evaluate their own projects, as well as the independent evaluator evaluating all of the national projects going on. So I think that's an important point. Otherwise, every project's tarred with the same brush, if you like, and you might be doing something much more innovative and taking more risks that isn't really being covered by the standard evaluation methodology. So I think that's a point worth making. I think Liz brought up an excellent point about the complexities of the different funding streams. So we talk about responding to voids and so on. But the funding might not be available at the time that you've got 5 or 6 or 10 voids that require retrofitting. I think also the funding can be constrain partners in that they can't do everything they'd like to do because the funding doesn't allow that. I'll give an example of that in some of NEA's work. So I'm really interested in time of use tariffs and utilising locally generated renewable energy in an area. The funding doesn't usually allow for that. So another example, the electrification of heat project, excellent project. We're involved in that. Some innovation in there, some limited innovation that was allowed within that funding. It doesn't allow the trial of time of use tariffs, apart from the very standard things that are available on USwitch and so on. So I think there's lots of opportunities to address this living laboratory type scenario and bringing together all these funding streams into one. So you've got DNO funding streams, network innovation competitions, you've got the BEIS funding, you've got ECO, that Guy mentioned, and so on. All very, very, very complicated to bring together. Liz mentioned that. So I don't know if that answers your question in enough detail, but
it does. I think the compliance challenges of kind of not tripping over the guidance does get in the way of stuff. We understand why each of the individual programs designed the way they are, but there's some. I keep saying this, and people at NA must hate me saying this all the time. But it's that bigger than the sum of its parts kind of mission is absolutely critical for that. Michael, brilliant. Thank you very much. So, with the rest of the panel, any of those other issues, deliberative democracy, least efficient homes, or the kind of lessons of innovation that we might want to bring? Guy, I can see you've come off mute, so I can only anticipate that means you've got something.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Adam, and thanks for the questions. And I'd picked up kind of Ruth's question about sort of the value for money sort of challenge there. So just kind of running through those in turn, and the sort of deliberative democracy as you described it, Adam, and that sort of involvement in engagement and kind of tenants. Are really great to hear from Liam, and we're really closely involved with the Northern Housing Consortium and are actually part of that tenants jury. So that's one of our mechanisms for kind of getting kind of input directly from tenants, are really valuable. We need to continue with that. We're also working closely with TPAS and the Tarot Trust again to make sure that we're getting that sort of tenant voice. I mean, Liz, thanks, referred to it in what she was saying in terms of how we've put tenant engagement really clearly at the heart of what we're expecting to encourage social housing landlords. to do more. I know that they all do engage with their tenants and the people that live in their homes, and put a priority on this. So you know, let's build on that. And we'll continue on that journey, and we'll continue to find ways to get that kind of direct involvement. But we see that as key to making this work, both having people in their homes involved in the design, and choices around what happens to their homes, how it's done, how it's carried out, how we can mitigate any of the sort of negative impacts on them, but also how we can both demonstrate the benefits, and I think that the sort of air quality as well as kind of lowering bills is an important aspect, and then working with tenants after all these things go in to help them make the most of the interventions. So absolutely, we're doing things, but have obviously more to be done. Just so Ruth's point about that kind of how do we make sure everybody's part of this journey? I mean, it's a really good one, and in fact, just before this session, we were having a workshop just on that very point, because it is one that kind of exercises us about how we make sure everybody can be part of this. I mean, before we launched Wave 1, we had specific engagement with smaller housing associations, because we're really sort of conscious they might get somehow squeezed out of this, and their voice not heard, and we might not account for them in the right way. So we started that engagement. That was really valuable. I mean, it led to some things changing within the way that we set Wave 1 up, but also gave us information kind of for the future. But I think there's more that we need to do to understand what's going to help most. I mean, we've got thoughts about how we can kind of support through the extension of the social housing retrofit accelerator, whether putting in place sort of procurement frameworks would help, whether it's bringing on board delivery partners that would help, whether it's about enabling collaborations and consortiums to form, whether that's small with small or small with big. And I know some are for that, and some have not so in favour of that. So yeah, I mean, absolutely conscious of that point, and the way that we set up certainly Wave 1, where we were kind of the incentives and the funds available for those kind of worst performing homes are kind of greater. We hope will help, but I think there's still a lot we need to understand about what's going to work best. So Ruth, be really happy to continue to engage beyond this, and that's something that we want to get into. And very quickly, sorry, I don't want to hog this, but on the innovation point, it's really good. The points that Michael made, I kind of recognise that the demonstrator one was a very particular sort of competition, and we want to continue that. I mean, one of the things that we're exploring for the longer term is, can we create an innovation stream of the decarbonisation fund? I don't know, because as you say, Michael, there's a lot of people playing in this space. So how do we work with both our colleagues in BAYS, in our science and innovation team? How do we work with Innovate UK, who have a lot of funding going into this space? How do we work with the university sector and the broader research base on this? So yeah, there are a lot of threads that need to be pulled together. I think we're in a good position to do that, but I think there's a bit of sort of time and resource question about how rapidly we can get into that space. But what I want to do, I mean, I've got an innovation background, so I'm absolutely for supporting innovation as far as we possibly can. But I take the point that there are multiple funds here, and it's not always clear what's designed to do what and how they work. So it's another kind of one of the things on my list of things to do. It's an ever-growing list, but simplicity, both for our own sort of scheme, but then how do we provide a more sort of joined up coherence across multiple sort of schemes and multiple funding streams, so we can provide almost kind of one-stop shop for people, and they don't need to worry about kind of what sits beneath, and we'll sort of take care of all the mechanics. They just kind of got one place to go for funds, and then we try and sort everything out underneath. So that's that I think that's my aspiration. So clearly
let's aspire to stuff. Can I on the innovation bit, on the innovation bit, can maybe Josh and possibly Liz as well, because innovation isn't just tech. It's about how you do things. So delivery innovation for us is just as important as who you do it for and how you do it with them as what the issue is. So Josh, there's questions about cost efficiency of the least efficient homes. Do you do whole homes, you do fabric first, and innovation delivery, and that's something that you mentioned in your contribution. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, so firstly, I mean, absolutely agree with the kind of, if you like, the first worst approach. I think that's going to be absolutely critical. Yes, I think it is going to be more expensive. I think to the government's credit, you know, the Home Upgrades Grant is sort of, you know, is considering more substantial funding for off-grid fuel bore homes. I think it's stipulating up to £25,000 for retrofits. So I think that is a positive development, and that is something that should be prioritised. I think just on the question of delivery itself, and the kind of, if you like, the discussion of fabric first versus sort of whole house heat. Well, first, I don't think it's necessarily a versus thing, but it was really interesting to hear from Liam kind of the insights about the climate jury and kind of the discussions about which they prefer. I think that was an absolutely fascinating insight. But I guess one of the things that we have found from our own research into that is that, you know, obviously, you know, fabric first should be an underlying principle, but we also kind of found that if you can do whole house approach, then that should really be ideally the gold standard. And part of the reason for that is, you know, I mean, yes, you should always take on people's concerns and kind of and account for that, but also there's not just, if you like, the disruption to the household then and there from having, you know, multiple instances of upgrade if you do fabric first and then you do low carbon heating later down the line, but also the way that the skills system is set up at the moment, it kind of, there's a bit of a siloed approach between energy efficiency and low carbon heating. And what that means is that, you know, there's a risk that you have someone who does insulation in your home, but then someone comes along later on and goes, okay, well, we need to put a heat pump in, but that also means we're going to have to take out some of that insulation. We're going to have to increase the pipe size there. We're going to have to install new radiators here and there. And, you know, that in some houses that will be fine. They won't need to have, you know, additional measures changed or anything like that. But there is a risk that you have households that, if you like, are retrofitted and then have those retrofits retrofitted in order to retrofit a low carbon heat pump. It's a bit like a sentence with buffalo in it, isn't it? But I think that, you know, so there is a real kind of, there's a risk that happens. And so to minimize the instance of doing that, you know, if you do both together, then that kind of, that minimizes that risk. It also, policies that kind of are designed in that way can help to bring the supply chains of installers and heating together, again, which is kind of really important and kind of help with the kind of innovation approaches there. So I think there's almost like, if you like, sort of skills and supply chain reasons why you would want to do whole house retrofitting as well.
Thanks, Josh. I mean, Liz, a lot of what you're doing is about projecting potential benefits, you know, kind of aggregating, disaggregating and re-aggregating again the data sets that people can understand the projections of what the benefits would be, both in terms of income. And what I'm kind of really, but you can answer what you ever want. What I'm really interested in is then the felt benefits of it, you know, the lived experience of being within a home that's been kind of optimized or improved in ways that you were expecting or not expecting, and how those sorts of data streams can feed back into the, you know, the human thermal comfort or cost comfort or whatever other experience of it. I mean, I'm just kind of interested in thinking about the other side of deliberative democracy, not just asking people what they think might happen and what they might prefer, but how you kind of get that fed back into what people actually experience and the benefits to their lives, and how we can make a difference to investment decisions.
So we don't really hold, oh, am I still mute? No, I'm all right.
You're not.
So we don't hold personal data, and we don't capture that information, but it is ties in slightly to a question that was raised on the chat. Back to the nuts and bolts of the data is about issues with RDSAP and the performance gap, and that and in the chat I've defended RDSAP and EPCs to a certain point, but that it is really important that we capture the data on performance, and not just the technical performance, but also the residents' experience. So my first experience of performance monitoring, I went into some social housing in Birmingham, and we were there to just collect the data on the heating and the temperatures and so on. And this development had won an Eco Development Award and everything, and we went up into the loft and found the insulation rolled up. And after 3 years of monitoring, after that point, we suspected there wasn't any cavity wall insulation either. But you know, and in the years since, we see a lot about data monitoring, but actually talking to the tenants, they knew what the issues were. They could tell you that the children couldn't sleep in the room above the garage because it was freezing. There was no insulation in that floor. You looked at the layout of their sitting room and all the sofas were the wall furthest from the window because it was so drafty. So yes, let's collect the data and feed back into the model, but also listen to your tenants. I mean, there are big reasons for that we know about as well, but they will know whether a home is performing.
I think that's brilliant. I think that's absolutely right. And Liam, I think that kind of ties into what you were saying. Any quick comments, Liam? I want to make sure that people are going to have, we'll be able to circulate the slides so people are able to see what happens with the summit and the publication of the data.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think just quickly building on what Liz and Josh had said there, I think a lot of the recommendations in this whole house first and fabric first, what it's indicating is preferences as in now, but it also will indicate a need for clearer communication, but maybe a need for leadership as well. And as long as people are brought along in the process, then they're kind of, whatever the decision's made, if they've contributed, then it's their decision as well.
That's brilliant. Thank you ever so much. So thanks, everybody. I've learned, well, I've heard lots of stuff. I learned some things. Some things just gone over my head. I'll go back and try to kind of improve my base knowledge on that. Thanks ever so much for everybody. Thank you for everyone who joined us as well. That's the last of the plenary sessions for Warm Homes Week. I hope that those of you watching now or kind of watching on the YouTube have enjoyed it and got something out of it. We're always really interested as NEA to understand what else we can do to try and bring together different interests in different parts of what we keep thinking of as the fuel poverty movement to deepen intelligence and get more practical solutions. So thank you to everybody. We have our exhibition that starts, I think, at 12 to 1. So please go along to that. If you're a voting member of NEA, we need to be core for the AGM. So please turn up to that as well. And see you on a virtual conference sometime soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Adam. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks, bye.